The following is a presentation of 13ABC Action News. Now, your table is ready. Join 13ABC's Jeff Smith with the decision makers of Northwest Ohio and Southeast Michigan. This is the Roundtable.
And a good Sunday afternoon to you. Thank you so much for spending some time with us. Hard to believe we are saying goodbye to 2012 this weekend and the next few days, but as always, we appreciate you spending some time with us. Over the last couple of weeks, it's been a hard conversation to have, obviously talking about the tragedies here in this country, the school shooting at Sandy Hook Elementary. A tough conversation to have, but an important one at that. And today we continue that conversation. A couple of weeks ago, we heard the president. He said the vice president was going to be tasked with putting together a plan, an action plan here in this country to combat violence. Here's ABC's Jake Tapper bringing us up to speed with where we are right now.
President Obama had promised the citizens of Newtown meaningful action. Good morning, everybody. And in a morning press conference, he explained what that meant. An administration focus on preventing future tragedies by focusing on mental health, culture, education, and gun control.
The fact that this problem is complex can no longer be an excuse for doing nothing. The fact that we can't prevent every act of violence doesn't mean we can't steadily reduce the violence and prevent the very worst violence.
Vice President Biden will head the initial effort with a January deadline for specific recommendations.
This is not some Washington commission. This is a team that has a very specific task to pull together real reforms right now.
The president's already made some demands, calling on Congress to ban the sale of high-capacity ammunition clips and what he called military-style assault weapons, and close the so-called gun show loophole that does not require background checks in many private sales. The tragedy at Sandy Hook Elementary appears right now to have been a tipping point for a national conversation about gun violence, one we've not seen in a long time.
They can fire 100 bullets in a minute if people know what they're doing with them.
And even some gun rights Democrats suggest something has changed.
I'll defend the Second Amendment till my dying breath. They know that I'm a proud owner and I'm a lifetime member of the NRA with straight A ratings. I've always been, and I hope always will be. But I also have a responsibility to speak up and say, listen, come to the table. I want to hear both sides.
So ABC's Jake Tapper there with that report, and obviously a lot of the conversation at the end there, and we want to welcome into the roundtable this afternoon Gene Brockmeyer, Dr. Gene Brockmeyer from the University of Toledo, clinical psychologist, a friend of the program, a friend, my friend for a number of years. We have stayed in contact over the years. We were talking about it before we came out here today. I think one of the first stories I ever did when I came back to the Toledo area was doing something on violence and the connection to video games. And once again, I mean, we are here moving into 2013, and we're back here again. We hear the president talk about, and obviously they focus on guns at the end of that piece, Gene, but we hear once again looking at our culture. And in our third segment today, I'm going to talk a little bit about our show from last week where we talked about religion and morals, but here we are at that culture question again. And your read right now on, is this a cultural issue we're seeing with this violence that's breaking out in schools, malls, you name it?
I think it's definitely a cultural issue, and the issue is that in our culture, violence is good. Violence is glorified, and there are no realistic consequences, at least in the fantasy violence that we see in video games and in other media.
You've done so many studies over the years. You're part of lawsuits that have been brought up through the numerous states that have looked on legislation of trying to get violence out of video games. But you said violence is good. Who are you saying is saying that?
I'm saying that especially the video game industry is saying violence is good. They make a lot of money out of doing violent video games, and those are the games that appear to sell the best.
We were talking about the release of this game, which you see right here, Call of Duty, in November, and breaking records. And we apologize for those at home who have not seen this type of stuff before, but bloodied people on a subway or on a bus right there, and obviously you see the guns in the video, and that is part of the fabric of this culture of video games that does very well. But in your field of study, you're trying to correlate what we see in the video games and people acting out this aggression, this false reality. Is that what you're finding?
Well, I think it's a complicated relationship where there are a lot of different factors that contribute to any particular behavior. And we think that for extremely violent behavior, exposure to violent video games could be one factor that just kind of tips a person over the edge. But obviously,
and it hasn't, and I want to say real quick, it has not been proven that Sandy Hook was linked in any way, shape, or form, the shooter linked to violent video game playing, anything along those lines. But if you were to send out a call to the administration, to the Vice President's task force looking at this issue, guns, culture, should video games have been on that list we saw in that story from Jake Tapper?
Well, I think video games probably will be on the list.
Do you?
In terms,
because I've talked to people who said that it shouldn't be.
Well, it's certainly a big cultural phenomenon, and it's a phenomenon that is definitely contributing to the glorifying of violence in society.
Where in your field of study have you seen, I guess, the inability of children, of teens, of adults to try to split down? I mean, I can grab a football game and know that I will never be on the field with anybody in the NFL, but I can act it out through video games. But why is there that loss of reality that we're seeing? What have you studied that shows you people losing their sense of reality?
Well, I think video games can be very deeply engaging, and I think when we get really involved in an activity, any kind of activity, we can go into kind of an altered state of consciousness, and depending on what we're doing while we're in the altered state of consciousness, we can be learning things that we're not even aware that we're learning.
Are you shocked that these shootings continue to happen?
I'm shocked that they happen, but I'm not surprised, because I think that we have a long way to go to understand why they happen.
You got into this field of study, obviously psychology, one thing, looking at the mind and how it, I guess, translates or correlates into video game playing. Over the decade and a half that I've known you and looking at this, why is there not more being said? And we'll get into the first, I guess we can go ahead and discuss the First Amendment issues that are continually brought up. Bring people up to speed, bring our audience up to speed on your knowledge as far as the lawsuits that have been out there. The state of California, Arnold Schwarzenegger's name on a lawsuit that was brought up in the state of California, and you were part of that, yes?
Well, California passed a law in 2005 that would prohibit the sale of a certain well-defined class of violent video games to children. Mm-hmm. And the game makers appealed the decision of the lawmakers, and it went through the various courts that it has to go through until it got to the Supreme Court in 2011. Mm-hmm. And in 2012, in June, the Supreme Court ruled that the law was...
Just a few months ago.
Right, right. They ruled that that law was unconstitutional. And so the Supreme Court decided that children should not be protected from very violent video games.
But one of the things, and you can look up this case at home, folks, but one of the things that you see in some of the writings that came out from the justices in their decisions, there is a real division. In this, we saw the division in this country, whether it be political in the November election, but there's also a very, I guess, obvious divide on the Supreme Court, because the opinions that came out from just this judgment and saying it was unconstitutional, Samuel Alito saying we can't be naive, looking at what is to come, the future of video games, what we have seen before, what we will see in the future, and how that affects. But some of the other justices on the Supreme Court, Justice Roberts coming out and saying a more forceful unconstitutional vote from him. But when you look at the division and not everybody's on board, how do you, it's like you go back to 12 Angry Men, and how do you crack that jury pool to try to make them understand what is the work that you guys are doing to try to get the word out in what you believe to be true?
Well, I think the justices had to consider many things in this decision. And one of the things that they considered was research, scientific research, and they simply weighed the evidence differently. Different judges weighed the evidence differently. I think there's a very convincing argument that we have scientific evidence that playing violent video games can increase aggressive thoughts and aggressive behavior, at least in the short term. We're still looking at the long term. But the other thing that they had to consider that's really important was precedent. And I think that they felt that this particular law from California was not strong enough to justify a precedent sort of against the First Amendment.
What does it say to you? There were a couple of movie premieres that were put off right after the Sandy Hook tragedy. Violent movies that were about to be released, and big premieres, a lot of money going into those. Those are put off. Is that a precursor for what we could see out of Hollywood, or is there just too much money to be made?
I think that's a good question. I think the most likely scenario to me is that within a few months, those movies will be released. And that it's just a temporary recognition that it's, you know, not socially acceptable right now.
The movies have come out. The movies have come out. It was just the big to-do of the premiere night and having all of the celebrities show up and obviously glorifying the fact that this is a violent movie, one, and two, this tragedy just happened in our country. Not in any necessary order, but obviously somebody saw it important to apply the brakes, at least tap them. Dick's Sporting Goods holding back on selling certain firearms in that region. So, I mean, what does it take, as far as from a psychological standpoint in this country, to think that these are better, longer solutions rather than short term?
I think we have to convince people that the media matters in terms of influencing people. And it's very strange to me because you can spend, I don't know, how many millions of dollars on a Super Bowl ad, and surely that's intended to influence people's behavior.
Yeah.
And you're viewing something on TV, and then you view another kind of, you know, entertainment media. We believe that that has an influence as well.
When we come back, I want to talk a little bit about desensitization to violence and looking at these games versus trying to make it real and talking to your kids about what happened at Sandy Hook, even students in high school and how they're dealing with it. We'll be right back right after this.